right, we're going to go ahead and get started. For anybody that doesn't know me, I am Jessica Gorman. I'm the director here at the museum. On behalf of the Dorcheat Historical Association, welcome. We're very happy to have everybody here tonight. Glad to have such a good turnout. Before we get started, I did just want to go ahead and let everybody know we do have an event planned for next month. So that will be on April 15th at 6 o'clock. And I will be the speaker for that one. And we're going to talk about preserving our cemeteries. So tonight we're very happy to have Mary Claire here to talk to us about Mount Lebanon. And I'm going to turn it over to her.
Well, thank you, Jessica. I'm just amazed that this many people turned out the night after the time change. So I hope you're not feeling any ill effects today. Well, I'm Mary Claire Kettler. I was a child of Mount Lebanon, a teenager of Gibbsland, a working adult in Georgia, near Savannah, Statesboro, Georgia, and a teacher. And now I'm back in Mount Lebanon, so I have just sort of come full circle. But I've always loved Mount Lebanon and the people of Mount Lebanon. And I was very fortunate to be a young child and know so many of the grandchildren of the founders of Mount Lebanon. So I feel very connected to the early beginnings of Mount Lebanon, and thank you for your interest. Of course, Mount Lebanon is a historical community that is just a few miles from here. And, well, there we go. Have to get my right buttons going. Martin Canfield is considered the father of Mount Lebanon. And in the spring of 1835, he set out from Edgefield District, South Carolina. And he was traveling west, horseback, scouting out the potential lands for settlement by a group of gentleman farmers from the Edgefield district. We have to remember that Andrew Jackson was president, and he was known as the expansion president. So there was a lot of encouragement for the United States to grow to the west. Why 1835 and why Mount Lebanon? Well, if we see what's going on at the time, let me back up, get my pointer going here. Okay. Edgefield is right here on the line of Georgia, across the Savannah River. And this area of Georgia was the Creek Nation. Now, we hear a lot about the Indians in North Carolina and the Cherokee being displaced to Oklahoma, but the Creek Nation was in Georgia. At the same time, they are being relocated to Oklahoma Territory. Before 1835, you had to have a passport from the governor of Georgia to legally enter Indian lands. So it would be difficult to take a caravan of settlers west through the Indian lands if that were still the case. But by 1835, 1836, the Second Creek War had ended, and that was no longer a problem. So Martin Canfield makes his way from here across Georgia, across Alabama and Mississippi, and he scouts his way into Louisiana. If we put into perspective what was going on at the time, in 1830, Mexico had stopped all of the legal immigration. So now they don't want people settling into Texas. In 1835, the Texas Rangers were formed to protect what settlers there were from the Indians. And in March of 1836, the Alamo falls after the Texas Declaration of Independence. So everything over in Texas territory here was a period of unsettled and unrest. So that may not have been attractive for Martin Canfield to take that into consideration. But I think what may have been the real stopping point for him was the Red River Raft. Can you imagine? He's traveled all the way across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and he gets to this mess. It was 8 miles below Shreveport and 17 miles above Shreveport. By the time Martin got there in the spring of 1835, Captain Shreve had only been able to remove the raft up to 12 Mile Bayou. So I'm sure when he got to Kane's Landing, which was the Bossier side, and Bennett's Bluff on the Shreveport side, he probably did an about face and thought, well, let me reconsider some of this land that I've just come across. Actually, Shreveport was not incorporated into a town until 1839. So Martin backtracks, and he starts reconsidering the land that he's passed over around Mount Lebanon, or what would become Mount Lebanon. Now, over in our part of the country, we sort of like to think that we are the backbone of Louisiana. The highest point is Driscoll Mountain. A few of us there above Gibbs would dispute that, because I show you this range, or this ridge, that runs in really sort of the dividing point between the watershed to the Red River and the watershed to the Washita. So Martin is looking at the land in this area, and he decides that, this might be pretty desirable. So he goes back, and by 1836, there are 8 families that arrive. They got to work getting the land patents, which was land grants, and they had those by December of 1836. Now, we know how slow the federal government processes things. I'm really impressed that these land grants started happening this fast. The post office was established in 1837, and I promised Jessica and Shelley, when they asked me about doing this program, of trying to make some relationship between Minden and Mount Lebanon, and one of that was the Drake family. So Reuben Drake was the first postmaster in 1837. Over the next 10 years, we had a lot of families from the Edgefield district that came. So we had really 2 waves of folks from Edgefield that came to Mount Lebanon. Now, a lot of settlements begin because they are on a body of water and they make a good port, or they're on a well-worn Indian trail and it just sort of happens. But there was a new concept that was emerging: planning cities before settlement began. And we see that that's what happened here in Mount Lebanon, because Mount Lebanon is planned with a parallelogram at the heart of its city or town. Businesses, church lots, residences, side streets, all radiated off of this parallelogram. And the parallelogram is about 9 acres, 240 feet wide, and about 1,600 feet long. Now, in modern urban planning started around the 1850s, but we have to keep in mind that George Washington had commissioned the Frenchman Pierre Charles L'Enfant to design the city of Washington, D.C. in 1791. And an 1802 map shows the Washington Mall. So the design concept was out there as these settlers began to come into Mount Lebanon. So we take a look. Oh, dang, I keep getting my wrong button, I apologize. Here we have our parallelogram. And if we think of it in comparison to Washington, D.C., there are two presidents with named streets on the National Mall, Madison and Jefferson. So here, our main street is Washington. A side street is Madison. Another street is Jefferson. And another street is Wall Street. Now, the first capital of the United States was in New York. And George Washington was sworn in at Federal Hall on Wall Street in New York City. So I'm not going to declare that there is a definite comparison, but I'll let you decide. There are just too many similarities. But for whatever, we know that the founders of Mount Lebanon were forward-thinking, and they were certainly adventurous who wanted to make their mark on the frontier. So if you come over, the parallelogram today, if you visited Mount Lebanon, is still very evident. And we think that, as you do here in Minden with your concept of your parallelogram, think that it's very special since so many towns have courthouse squares. Yes. Now, the next thing, we get the town laid out and we start to think about where will they worship, because these are very staunch Baptists who have come from Edgefield District, South Carolina. Well, they got there and there was a church that was some miles distant to the east, and they went there for a little bit, but for whatever reason, and you know sometimes Baptists just don't find where they need to settle in, that didn't quite agree with them, so there was a first church was a building somewhere distant to the east of Mount Lebanon as we know it today. We're not sure, and we haven't been able to exactly pinpoint or locate where that first small church building that they worshipped might have been. But they organized Rehoboth Baptist Church in July of 1837. And this is meaningful to me. On September of 1837, on motion by the church, it was agreed that a good blank book would be purchased to record the church history. And that is just phenomenal to me because it gave us so many primary sources of history knowledge about the goings-on of Mount Lebanon. And I just love that. They agreed to purchase a good blank book. Well, the church as we know it today is the third church. The first one was the small church, and in 1840, it was in the minutes, that they agreed to move the church into Mount Lebanon if Brothers Drake, Canfield, and Tandy Key would agree not to conduct business on the Sabbath. So, I guess those three men agreed because they moved the church in to just to the west of present-day Mount Lebanon, and it was designated with a graveyard tract. So those of you who visited us and you know Mount Lebanon Cemetery, the church was in that general area, you know that long area that's out front before you get to the gates of the cemetery. Church was there, and they started the graveyard. And that church eventually burned. Now, have any of you served on church committees? I got an amen for that, didn't I? Well, we had a committee. And the committee is now trying to decide where this third church is going to be built. So let me backtrack just a moment. They thought at one time, you know, Martin Canfield had something, property back here. Maybe we could put the church back here. And then, well, along here on the parallelogram, maybe we could put it there. And then Mr. Key came up and decided that he would sell them that lot right there for $100. Okay, we are now set. But, as fate would have it, Reuben Drake lost this parcel of land in a sheriff's sale. And Dr. Gibbs purchased that tract of land in a sheriff's sale in February of 1856. And he turned around and he donated it to Rehoboth Baptist Church in April. So, well, phooey on that little lot. We're going to move the church down here at the end of the parallelogram. And those of us who love Mount Lebanon can't imagine the church being anywhere else than where it is today. Well, that church committee wasn't quite over with. We now have to decide the size of this church. They started off, it was going to be 40 by 60 with an 18-foot ceiling for $2,500 limit on the building cost. Then the next week or two they came back and they said, no, let's make it 40 by 70 with a 22-foot ceiling, but we're not going to pay any more than $2,200. And then I guess maybe the ladies got involved and they said, no, we're going to move the pulpit from the north end of the church to the south end of the church. Well, today, our present day church is 40 feet wide, 64 feet long, with a 19.5-foot ceiling. So I guess there was a little compromise there. The other things that we are so known for was the Louisiana Baptist Convention began there in 1848, and then the Women's Missionary Society of Louisiana was organized in 1874. And those are two things that we're very proud of in Mount Lebanon. And for some reason, when this third church got built, they decided to change the name from Rehoboth to the Mount Lebanon Baptist Church in 1860. Some notable pastors. There was a free man of color by the name of Henry Adams. He was born in Georgia, just across the Savannah River from Edgefield, and he presumably traveled west with this convoy of settlers, and since he was the only ordained preacher in the bunch, he became the first pastor of Rehoboth Baptist Church. Henry Adams served for a while and then eventually located to Louisville, Kentucky, and established a grand church there in Louisville for free men of color. And I was in Louisville a few years ago, and I found the church that he organized, and it's still there. Now, Henry, even though he's a free man of color, he owned property in and around Mount Lebanon. And when that property was sold, it was designated that the proceeds from that sale went to buy Bibles for children in Africa and in the United States. So he must have been a mighty good man. Our other connection to Minden is George Washington Baines. And he was the one that was responsible for organization of the Louisiana Baptist Convention in 1848. And he went on to become the president of Baylor University, and as we all know, his great-grandson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was our 36th president of the United States. Now this is, to me, kind of an interesting story. Baines came to Mount Lebanon from near Harrison, Arkansas. And he was expelled by that church when it was taken over by hard-shelled Baptists. Now, I don't want to get up in your Baptist business, but hard-shell, their main issue with George Washington Baines was the concept of predestination. They also are opposed to Masons, theological seminaries, Bible and missionary societies, and a new concept that was beginning to be floated around, the concept of Sunday school. So I think with the life of George Washington Baines and what he went on to do and the establishment of churches and the Baptist conventions and all of the missionary and sort of the evangelical aspect of him, this Calvinistic theology of the hard shell would have been very much in opposition, I think, to his beliefs. So we were fortunate that he came to us in Mount Lebanon and then the Saline Church and then on into Minden before he exited to Texas. As Mount Lebanon became an influential town, the community leaders decided that they needed an institution to educate a learned clergy. In 1853, the preparatory department of the Mount Lebanon University opened to students. And in 1854, the collegiate department admitted 94 students with Dr. Bartholomew Egan as its first president. Now, they wanted somebody else, and I'll mention him a little later, but he just didn't feel the call at the time, so he didn't come. And they were so disappointed, but that was not going to let them deter having the university get started. So Dr. Egan stepped up and became its president. Shortly after this, we had the Female Academy that was located behind the Third Methodist Church, and a library. And we take libraries for granted today, but that was such an important aspect of the founding of this university that they received $500 endowment from this newly formed Louisiana Baptist Convention to get their library started. At the zenith in 1861, there were 127 students enrolled in the university. But sadly, it was soon to close because of the Civil War. All the young men were called away to the war effort, and it had to close and would not reopen until 1865. The university became co-educational under the presidency of W.P. Carter in 1883. And the most successful years when steam, heat, and waterworks were added under the presidency of W.M. Reese in 1887. But it wasn't to last long. In 1906, the trustees decided they just were going to have to relinquish the university and allow it to be moved to the central part of the state. So in 1906, it was moved to Pineville, and thus we know it today as Louisiana College. Education has always been so important to Mount Lebanon. Of the Louisiana Tech presidents, we have 3 that have come from Mount Lebanon with a combination of 34 years. Those of you, if anyone went to Tech, you know Robinson Hall. He was a teacher at Mount Lebanon University and went on to become president of Louisiana Tech. Claybrook Cottingham had married one of the Baker girls, and he became president of Louisiana Tech. And then, of course, F.J. Taylor, he had one foot in Mount Lebanon and one foot in Gibbs. And he was the longest serving, I believe, at about 25 years of president. And many of us got our education under F.J. Taylor. Also, we had two that became presidents of Baylor University. I mentioned George Washington Baines. He was at Baylor president from 1861 to 1863, and he was pastor, of course. William Carey Crane was Baylor president from 1864 to 1885. It was sort of double duty. Once the university came into being, you were called to be pastor of Mount Lebanon Baptist Church and president of the university. So he served both roles there in Mount Lebanon from 1860 to 1863. Now, I have not had a chance to follow this thread, but there was a big blow up with William Carey Crane and the church. I don't know exactly what happened, and when I figure it out, I'll have to let you know. But I would love to get to Baylor and go through William Carey Crane's papers to see how it compares to our Mount Lebanon papers that we have. But something happened, and he left quite abruptly from Mount Lebanon. But, you know, he did okay for himself when he got to Baylor, so that might have been a godsend. One other president that would round out 6 presidents from our area. Jesse Stone was president of Southern University in 1974, and he was from Gibbsland. So when I say education is important to our area, it's evident by that with all the educational leaders. Now, Mount Lebanon during the Civil War. The university, of course, is now vacated of students, so it becomes a hospital. And in 1864, Governor Henry Allen commissions Dr. Bartholomew Egan to establish the State Medical Laboratory for the production of medicines for both soldiers and civilians. Medicinal alcohol, turpentine, castor oil, and morphine are some of the things that we know that were produced, and these were used for a wide variety of ailments and in treatment of injuries in the Civil War. The buildings of the female academy were acquired for the laboratory, and adjacent to that was a medicine well. And in my childhood, the medicine well still existed. Now it's full of trash, but it was where they used to store medicines that needed, I guess, to be kept at a certain temperature. Now, it goes without saying that Governor Allen was extremely appreciative to Dr. Egan for sending him some of the medicinal alcohol one Christmas. But I guess if they're going to cut off an arm and a leg, that swig of alcohol will, be better than nothing. I did, in Dr. Egan's papers, find an invoice for medicines that were dispensed from the state lab, and I've got about 3 doctors and 2 pharmacists working on that list to see if they can decipher what some of these things are. About the only thing that really pops out was morphine, but there are a number of things listed. And one other thing that was interesting to me, and I hadn't been able to figure it out, on the papers for the state lab, they bought a lot of bottles, people would sell bottles, and I'm not sure where all these bottles would have come from. If, we had maybe someone that was able to do, glass blowing or bottle making or whatever, but the invoices show that a lot of bottles were purchased, maybe for that alcohol that they were sending to government. I'm just saying. One thing I do want to point out here, look, this is the chapel of Mount Lebanon University. This is the administration building. And the facade of this building is what Mount Lebanon Baptist Church was before it was remodeled through the years. It had the two doors, one for men, one for women, and the Mount Lebanon Baptist Church had the divider down the center, men on one side and women on the other. So this is what the original church looked like in its facade, and the same plan was used here at the university. Mount Lebanon had a printing office. One of the biggest things that they printed was the Louisiana Baptist newspaper. They also, during the Civil War, printed money. Everything from a nickel to a $10 bill was printed. But the thing that we probably are most known for is the 5-cent stamp, because it's a reverse image. I think Postmaster Wells carved the stamp impression as he looked at it. But when it was used as a stamp, it came out in reverse. So here is a letter from one of Mount Lebanon's businesses, Thurman's, to someone in New Orleans with the reverse stamp. This stamp sold for $385,000 in 1999. I bet there are a lot of people wish they had saved more correspondence. Now, Mount Lebanon was a center of commerce. We had the post office, got started in 1837, and it lasted until 1955. And some of you may have known Virginia Morrow Newman Yardley. She lived here in Mendon, and she was the last postmistress. Parnell's blacksmith shop, John Mark's back there, he's still paying taxes on it. It was a postage stamp area of land across the street from the stagecoach stop, and his ancestor took care of a lot of the horseshoeing and keeping the horses up for the stage line. We had manufacturing facilities, textiles, brick making, pottery, lumber supplies, and we had some extremely talented carpenters in the area. This is J.L. Baker General Merchandise Store. It was pretty much full service, had plantation supplies, furniture, and coffins. So whatever you might need, they had it. I love this story. This was Mr. Stahl. He came from Prussia by way of New Orleans. And he thought, Mount Lebanon sounds promising, so he came from New Orleans to Mount Lebanon. And you can see here with some of his prices, in today's dollars, his boots would cost about $600. So they were, and also the fact that he did have some that were made. They didn't have to all be custom made. He had some that were made. I guess people stopped through for a short period of time, might not have time to wait on a pair of shoes. This is a letterhead. This is the same company that had mailed the stamp but that was their letterhead. And then this is what the business district of Mount Lebanon looked like. At the time, Mr. King was the postmaster, and that was his store along with the post office. The post office had a tendency to move around with whatever merchant happened to be the postmaster at the time. The other thing that people know Mount Lebanon for, of course, is the stage line. We have Stagecoach Trail that runs through the heart of Mount Lebanon. And here you can see the schedule for the North Louisiana Stage Line in 1877. And this is Stagecoach Inn. This is an interesting family story, of that family, not mine. But Emily Smith was married to Captain Jesse Smith. Now, I might add that they were staunch Methodists in the midst of all these Baptists. But anyway, he was too old for the Civil War. He was in the bottoms harvesting salt in 1862, developed pneumonia, and died. Now, Emily is left with about a household of 60 people, 15 of them children, all looking to her for their next meal and to be taken care of. So in 1869, at the age of 50, Emily bought this home in Mount Lebanon and Lester from the Prothrows, but it had been built by Reuben Drake in 1847. So she set about operating the stagecoach stop for the line between Vicksburg or Monroe and Shreveport. And I just so admire that lady for taking that on in that day and age and finding a way to support her family. Notice that they would have left Monroe at 6 o'clock in the morning. They would arrive in Mount Lebanon at 3 a.m. and they would have paid $6 for the privilege of a 21-hour trip of 65 miles. Now, there are some things written that are not very complimentary of stagecoach travel in the day, but I guess it got you from point A to point B. Now, where was this stagecoach line? The stagecoach line started in the early 1860s. It started, I apologize for my wrong finger. It started here with Monroe. And it went to Forksville, Trenton, Forksville, and then it went to Vienna. And then it made a little loop, and there was one of the stagecoach stops that was Walnut Creek. And on some of the old maps, you can still find Walnut Creek slightly above Simsboro. So it made a little dip, and it came to Arcadia, or here's another little community that's lost in time, Quay. I have not found anybody. I've asked hunters, I've asked people from Claiborne Parish, Lincoln Parish line, if they know about Quay, but nobody seems to know where that community was. But it's very prominent on these old maps. It turned at Quay and it started southern route. Arcadia was a little farther south than it is today. It came through Arcadia, and we knew exactly where the stagecoach line was between Arcadia and Mount Lebanon, because as a child you could still travel that, and it would come out in front of Stagecoach Inn and all the way to around the golf course and the airport south of Arcadia. Now, some thoughts about where did it leave Mount Lebanon and then make the rest of its route. On these old maps, there's nothing here road-wise even though Nine Forks was located about here, we don't see a clear and distinct road that we see here to Buckhorn. Now, Buckhorn has sort of disappeared, but I think it's in the general area of Yellow Pine. The reason we feel pretty strongly that the stagecoach route went that way is because the main thoroughfare out of Mount Lebanon was the Port Bolivar Road. Port Bolivar was a port on Lake Bistineau, and that's how they got all their goods shipped up from New Orleans. Things would come up Red River, they would come into Lake Bistineau, they would come into Port Bolivar, and then they could transport them, and Port Bolivar is about right there. So the logic is that the road would have run there and then turned, I guess, north. It's not until 1890s or after that we begin to see the distinction of the Dixie Overland Highway coming through, as we know Highway 80 today and Nine Forks. So this isn't exactly true to the military road that ran from Fort Smith down to Natchitoches and up to Fort Jessup, but that seems to be along the portion of that. And then it made its venture on into Bellevue, which was a very prominent town for its day, had a newspaper, and then on into Shreveport. So that's a question that we're oftentimes asked is about the stage line or how it went across. Do I have any 4-H'ers in here? If you were a 4-H'er, you know all about fairs and getting stuff ready for fairs. This was the agricultural fair that was held, the second one, in 1859. In 1857, notice that a lot of stuff is happening between 1852 and 1860. That was 10 years of great expansion and growth. The agricultural fair was started, or the Bienville Agricultural Society was organized in 1857. And here you can see everything from harness horses, goats, jacks, quilts. I can't believe in this Baptist community, they had 3 different kinds of wines that were exhibited. All kinds of goods that we typically think of as being exhibited at the state fair. Now, down here in the fine print, they were encouraging people to come in their wagons and prepare to stay in their wagons or camp out because they weren't sure that all of the Mount Lebanon residents would be able to absorb the crowds that would be coming for the agricultural fairs. If you know anything about Mount Lebanon, next door to our museum, that lot is designated in land descriptions as the fairgrounds lot. So we know that that's where the agricultural fairs were held. Now I want to tell you about 2 other enterprising young men that I'm just sort of fascinated with. There was a young man by the name of Harvey Couch and Will Egan Baker. Harvey Couch worked for the Railway Mail Service. Now, if I've got you youngsters in here and you're not sure about what this Railway Mail Service was, remember depots used to have a pole with an arm extended out and they would hang the mail bag on that, and as the train came through they would hook it and away they would go. There was a car designated on the railroad where they sorted the mail, and when they got mail sorted for a town and they passed through, if they didn't stop, they would just throw the mail bag out. There was a cart there that took it to the post office. And Harvey, they were at a water stop, and he started asking some of these men what were these poles that they were putting up along the railway. And he didn't think they were telegraph. Well, it was this new contraption called telephones. So Harvey goes back. He's about 10 years older than Will Egan. But he contacts his friend Will Egan from Mount Lebanon, and they talked about this. And they decided that there probably would be a good chance that it could go over between Gippsland and Mount Lebanon. Because you see, all the mamas lived in Mount Lebanon, and all the daughters had moved to Gippsland with their husbands to the new city. And you know, mamas and daughters are going to talk. So they strung telephone wire from Mount Lebanon to Gippsland, and it was quite successful. They formed the North Louisiana Telephone Company in 1904, and in 1911 they sold it. It had 1,500 miles of line, 50 exchanges in 4 states to Southwestern Bell for over $1 million. Now, much to Judy's chagrin here, because this was her great uncle, Harvey Couch bought Will Egan out of his partnership. But Will Egan continued to work with the company. Both men ended up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and they went on. Will Egan remained a bookkeeper and trusted confidant and worker. They went on to incorporate and found Louisiana Power and Light, Mississippi Power and Light, and Arkansas Power and Light. Wow. So they were quite successful young men, and I just love their story. And then we come to our Mount Lebanon Cemetery, of which we are extremely proud. It was the graveyard tract for the second church. I learned something interesting, and I haven't checked this out. They said the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard, a cemetery stands by itself alone, and a graveyard is a church yard. So that was, in the early days, it's referred to as the graveyard. And today we know it as Mount Lebanon Cemetery. The earliest tombstone is Eliza Drake Canfield. Martin Canfield's wife died in childbirth in 1837. So hers is the first tombstone that we have recorded there. Sadly, we have 13 unknown Confederate soldiers buried in Mount Lebanon. It breaks my heart to think about there were families somewhere in the South that their loved one never came home and they never knew what happened to them. But trust me, they have been lovingly cared for in the Mount Lebanon Cemetery, because the ladies saw to it in 1924 that they got markers. So we have the 13 unknown soldiers. We think that they were transported to us in Mount Lebanon to the hospital from the Battle of Mansfield in April of '64, or from the Battle of Pleasant Hill. Today's roads, it would make no sense to bring someone that distance. But if you look on the old maps, they would easily just cross Red River at the ferry in Campty, and then it's a straight shot up to Buckhorn and then across to Mount Lebanon. So we think that that may be the reason that they were brought to Mount Lebanon. But anyway, we We have daffodils on their graves and everything. This is typical of many of the old burials. They were above ground or had the encasements above ground. Thanks to Lester Martin up here front and center, we have 7 Greek Revival homes and the Mount Lebanon Baptist Church on the National Register of Historic Places in 1980. And Lester did a lot of research and a lot of documentation for these homes. The Culbert Place is where Marcia lives. It was 1860s. Dog Trot is across the street from the Mount Lebanon Baptist Church, and this is where Tandy Key operated his hotel. As a child, I was always fascinated. This room right here and this room right here, off this long central hallway or gallery, was designated as the stranger's room. So if someone came along, maybe they looked a little scruffy and suspicious, but they needed lodging for the night, they were given the strangers' rooms because those rooms had no access to the rest of the house. They had one way in and one way out, and there was no interconnecting doors to where the main family lived. I don't know why I bothered. I mean, they weren't locking doors anyway, but anyway, those were strangers' rooms. Wayside Cottage has become a mission for me and Lester and several others.
Who's Lester?
As in Martin. And also Charlie Andrews. Charlie, Marcia's husband, was so set to save Wayside Cottage. Wayside Cottage was built as the president's home for Mount Lebanon University. It was the enticement for them to get Jesse Hartwell to come to Mount Lebanon. Jesse was a renowned theologian, and they had called him in 1853-54, and he didn't come. So they built him a president's home, and he finally came in 1857 and died shortly thereafter. But we're determined to save Wayside, and we're working on that. Down Home is held by the same family with the original land grants, and Herbert and Jennifer Newman reside there. And poor Herbert, he has painted on that place for the last 3 years, but I think he has finally finished it. The Thurman House is next door to me, and was also in my childhood known as the Prothrow Place, and Lester's relatives lived there. Ms. Lester Jedd, I believe. I throw this one in because I just want you to know that even through the Victorian era, we continue to have some really nice homes in Mount Lebanon. Just look at this Victorian home, very, very different from your typical central hallway home. The Howerton home, sadly, has disappeared. But if you got good eyes, can you see their fire escape? Oh, yeah. That ladder nailed to the side of the house. I love that. Our Mount Lebanon Historical Society started in 1968. The museum was built in 1972. It's just 3 miles south of Gibbsland on 154. And I'll leave you with this. I love this photograph. My friend Pam Stogsdill took this from the bedroom window of Tandy Key's hotel across the street. It was written by Jamie Thurman Morrow in 1948. In the midst of stately oaks and peace stands the quiet sanctuary of Mount Lebanon Baptist Church, with a welcome to all who enter the door. Generations of faithful people have prayed and worshiped in this sacred place. Whosoever will, let him come. And that's pretty much how we feel in Mount Lebanon. We like to be known for our hospitality. We love for people to come visit, and we hope that maybe you will. And I'd like to leave you with one invitation. I have to read it since it's so special. This is one more connection to Minden. This was in the Caucasian, which was the Shreveport newspaper, in May of 1907. From the quaint old town of Mount Lebanon, embowered with majestic trees, with prim, old-fashioned gardens, fragrant with sweet shrubs and jasmine hedges and roses, comes the following invitation. Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Jackson Colbert request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Annie Louise, to Dr. Resnan Ernest Smith, Wednesday afternoon, May the 22nd at 3 o'clock at Aaronville, Mount Lebanon, Louisiana. The bride-elect is of aristocratic lineage. Being the granddaughter of Dr. and Mrs. J.C. Egan of Shreveport, the family home, Aaronville, will be the glory of May, blossoming to celebrate the nuptials of this bonny bride. The fortunate suitor, Dr. Smith, comes from a prominent old Louisiana family, between whose people and other families there is a close bond of long cemented friendship. Now, this is the granddaughter of Bartholomew Egan. He is the grandson of Emily and Jesse Smith, and he was your doctor here in Minden. There were two Dr. Smiths, the elder Dr. Smith, and this is the younger Dr. Smith. And I might add that all of this took place at Marcia's home in Mount Lebanon, and I guess Aaronville was a tip of the hat to their Irish ancestry. So Marcia, we will all be at your house on May the 22nd at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. Thank y'all for your attention and your interest in Mount Lebanon. It has been a real joy for me to be with you this evening.
Thank you, Mary Claire, for such a wonderful presentation. And Dr. Smith, the elder Dr. Smith, we actually have a little bit of a connection because my sister now lives where Dr. Smith lived in Dubberly, the elder Dr. Smith.
Okay.
Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed it. Again, thank you all for coming. There's still food over here if anybody would like anything else to eat, and hope to see you all on April 15th.